Hi, it's Ted Asregadoo, and this is Truthout Interviews. On the show is Max Haiven. He is a writer, a teacher, and an activist, and he's penned a piece on Truthout about financial totalitarianism. Welcome to the show, Max.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, first off, let's talk about the term fascism. We hear this a lot in the popular media now. People are very quick to call each other fascists over certain things, especially when they disagree with them politically. But the term seems to be misused as of late in the public realm. So in your article, you do use this term, and I believe you use it correctly. I took a lot of political theory classes and read about fascism. But what does the term mean for those that maybe are sort of pulled into the misuse of it?
I think there's two levels of meaning to the word. There's a particular historic meaning, which is important to keep in mind, and then there's a certain rhetorical value to it. I think the historic meaning traces its roots back to Mussolini's government in the 1930s in Italy, where Mussolini had begun as some form of authoritarian socialist, and eventually his ideology sort of developed into this idea that citizens should be totally subordinate to the state, and that all elements of society should be oriented towards the nation, towards a sort of singular heroic vision of what the nation was. A nation that was, of course, racially pure, unified, and that sort of had very little space for any form of dissent. Mussolini, of course, very famously was extremely repressive towards other political ideas and voices, and would marshal sort of large elements of society towards glorifying the idea of the fascist government, the idea of a fascist Italy, a certain idea of fascist history, and then actually going out and beating up and repressing all sorts of dissenters. And then, of course, this was also taken up by the Nazi Party in Germany, who developed their own form of fascism in Nazism, with an even stronger focus on sort of racial purity, on the complete control of the state of all aspects of society. So there's a certain historical way to talk about fascism that's very important. But then there's also the ways that we can see what some critics call proto-fascism, or others call fascist tendencies at work in many different societies. So in societies where the state is increasingly interested in policing not only the sort of political life of their citizens, but also the social life, the cultural life, the economic life, you begin to see this form of fascist thinking enter into it, even if you don't have the formal system of government that you would, identify as fascism. And what I wanted to do in this article is to point out that this sort of fascistic or totalitarian power not only emanates simply from the halls of government, it can also emanate from other spheres of activity, especially in life, especially the economic sphere. So we live in a situation where the financial realm has such an incredible power, not only over our economy, but also over politics, the society at large, and our sort of cultural and personal lives, that it's worth at least entertaining the thought experiment of understanding the power of the financial realm as fascistic or totalitarian.
Yes, and on your piece in Truthout, you link to an article in the publication International Labor Review. The piece was written by Richard Freeman. It's about financialization, and I believe that's the title. It's financialization. So how does financialization relate to this ideology of fascism or totalitarianism or fascistic ideas that you sketched earlier?
Well, most analyses of this tendency we call financialization limit themselves to speaking about its impacts on the economic realm and the impacts on politics. So in the economic realm, financialization basically refers to the proportion of the gross domestic product of any country that is represented by basically speculative wealth, the sort of gambling that goes on Wall Street, or in the city of London, which is their financial district, or in sort of the main banking industries around the world. And financialization increasingly drives what we see is in nations and around the world. As financialization increases, we see an increased concentration of wealth in the hands of a very, very, very powerful, very, very tightly connected group of investment bankers, hedge fund managers, and a sort of financial class. And they use this power in various nefarious ways. So, for instance, as part of this, we can see the actions of private equity funds, which specialize in buying up distressed companies, gutting them, firing workers, destroying pension plans, selling off portions of the company, and then reselling it on the market for a markup value. And we also see the financial industry through the loans that it gives to corporations, through the loans it gives to governments, imposing what we've come to know as sort of neoliberal austerity, which is the idea that you should globalize your production, you should fire workers, downsize, cut back on workers' salaries, render workers' occupations more precarious, that is, more part-time, more temporary, contract-based. So you basically see the financial sector increasingly running the whole economy in their own interests. And their own interests are basically short-term profit. They don't have a vision of, a better society in mind. They simply are looking for quarter-to-quarter improvements in rates of return and stock prices. So this is the sort of economic end of financialization, the increasing way that corporations and governments see themselves as basically financial corporations. You also see the influence of finance and financialization over governments. I mean, there's very few governments around the world now who are not extremely heavily indebted. And the problem is not debt in and of itself, it's who they're indebted to. And they're indebted to international bond markets, international investment banks, who can increasingly call the tune of public policy because they hold a sword over the heads of governments. And we're not just talking about the governments of nation states, we're also talking about city governments, provincial or state governments. We're talking about even things as small as universities. But of course, also we're talking about whole nations like Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. The sort of economic crisis that they're going through now is largely due to these international financial interests who then get to dictate the policy. And the name of that policy that we understand now as austerity. It's the idea that you need to cut back on every social services from healthcare to media to education in order to basically make enough money to pay back the loans that you should have never had to take out in the first place. So financialization then refers to these sort of economic and political shifts. But what I wanted to do in this article, and what I do in my scholarly work, and what many others are doing, is also extend this idea of financialization outward to talk about society and culture as well.
Exactly. Yeah. That was my next question, was that you sketched on the micro level, or the macro level, that is, how financialization has affected everything from world government, or large nation states, to city governments, to, as you put it, even universities are loaded up with debt at times. Now we get to the micro, which is the individual, and that's something that you talk about, and you link the two together. So we have debt on the macro level, and now we're going to have, I suppose, debt on the micro level. I think we've all kind of relate to that at some level at this stage of the game.
Yeah. No, precisely. That now we are encountering a situation where the vast majority of us are surviving on some level, on some form of debt, whether that's the mortgage of our house, whether that's student loans, whether that's our credit card debt, debt for cars, debt for having debt, because people end up having to go further into debt to pay off the interest payments on their already existing debt. I think in the United States and Canada and many other places as well, this is becoming the norm of life. So we not only see this financialization at the level of economic actors like corporations and governments, we also see it on the level of daily life. And there's this whole sociology that's, I think, built up around this. And very interesting authors have recently dealt with this. For instance, David Graeber's recent book on the history of debt is extremely interesting. And various other people have started to look at the way that this debt is part and parcel of this shift to a much more precarious, uncertain existence for all of us. An existence where we can no longer really expect any guarantees from life, where we constantly feel we're sort of free-floating economic agents with nothing to bind us together. And to tie it back to the question of fascism and totalitarianism, the famous 20th century political philosopher Hannah Arendt rightly pointed out that the breeding grounds for that real form of state fascism is a condition of incredible disconnection and alienation among the population. And that when people are feeling so isolated and so downtrodden, as they were, for instance, in Germany before the fascists took over, in part because the other European nations had forced Germany to pay such intolerable reparations for the First World War, you get a breeding ground for fascist understandings. And it's a very scary situation. And I think what we're seeing with debt is a great example of that, right? People feel that that their debt is their own fault, that they're increasingly isolated economic actors, and that they're looking for someone to solve these problems for them. And when people look for those sort of easy solutions, they're very easily drawn to the sort of fascist charisma, which we've seen time and again, and in fact is a large part of the far right in the United States today and in Canada.
It is a bit like, I think it was Bill Maher who once was talking about the reason why it's very difficult for people to get angry en masse in this country about the way in which whether it's their economic downward mobility is going, whether it's they're losing their home, some aspect of the economic life that's impacting them or affecting them negatively. And he said it comes down to this, that you see these people on TV that are very successful, whether they're celebrities or whether they're financial millionaires or billionaires, and they look at them and they think, I could be that person. That could be me. So they buy into that. And then he just turned to the camera. He says, I got some news for you. It's not going to be you. I mean, it's going to be easier probably in a way to win the lottery than it would be to get to where, he is, to where Donald Trump is, to where all these people that say, you too can make it. But we buy into this myth all the time. I think a lot of it has to do with, at least for the last 50 years here in the United States, that there was this sense of the American dream that each generation is going to do better than the previous one. And now, after really once Reagan came into office, and that changed, it has been wages have either stagnated or have gone down for the vast majority of workers, and you don't see the number of millionaires and billionaires increasing. In fact, the 1% tends to hang on to their wealth pretty well, and they, as you said, they're very tightly connected, and they not only hold financial power over people, but certainly political power as well. Finishing up, I was wondering, towards the end of your article, you sketch an alternative to financialization. You talk about the commons, but what would you call this alternative?
I don't think it has a particular name because, unlike a lot of political ideologies which try and sort of name a star upon the horizon to which we can sort of trek, the idea of the commons is both an ideal and an actually existing thing. So, I mean, we are building commons all the time. Often our families are common spaces, our neighborhoods, our schools, any places where people gather and they make common cause outside of the logic of the market, outside of a sense that you need to buy and sell things in order to survive. So I think that's happening all the time. And in fact, the things that matter in our lives are not the ones that we pay for. This is a truism that you can hear again and again almost everywhere, but it's very true that really the things that we have in common and the places that we build, like community gardens, like community daycare centers, like when workers get together and form cooperatives or people form housing cooperatives. These are all forms of commoning or building new commons that exist in the real world. But the vision is, what would happen if we then took the principles of those ideas, the principles that individuals at the grassroots should have economic, political, social, and cultural control over their lives, and we tried to imagine how to make that the norm and how to link all of those different common areas of our lives amongst hugely diverse populations in order to build something that could replace and capsize the sort of financialized top-down model that we're presently living under. So I'm not sure that necessarily has a name, but it is on its way to naming itself, perhaps.
Okay, well, Max's piece is on Truthout for you to read. It's powerful stuff, and I encourage you to read it. Share it with your social networks as well. And remember to subscribe to this channel. You can do so by clicking the box in your left-hand corner of your screen. Max, I want to thank you for being on the program.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll see you next time on Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo.